Zektar had always prided himself on being unshakable. In his 4 centuries of service to the Galactic Monitoring Council, he had observed the rise and fall of 17 civilizations, witnessed 3 separate planetary extinctions, and documented countless wars that had torn apart entire star systems. Nothing surprised him anymore. Or so he thought. The assignment seemed routine when it first appeared on his console. Species classification: human. Planet: Earth. Solar system: Sol. Mission: combat assessment for galactic integration protocols. Standard procedure for any species approaching faster-than-light capability. The Council needed to know what they were dealing with before humanity joined the galactic community. Zektar's 3-chambered heart beat steadily as he initialized the observation protocols from his stealth ship positioned beyond Earth's detection range. His species, the Valkyrie, had evolved as natural observers. Their enhanced neural pathways could process and analyze combat data faster than any artificial intelligence, making them perfect for military assessments. The first human conflict he observed was what they called World War I. Through his advanced monitoring systems, Zektar watched men charge across muddy fields into machine gun fire. He documented their primitive weapons, their basic tactics, their simple motivations. The humans fought over territory, resources, and pride. Nothing unusual there. But something nagged at him as he compiled his initial reports. The humans kept fighting even when victory seemed impossible. They charged into certain death not for strategic advantage, but for their companions beside them. Zektar had seen loyalty before, but this was different. This was something that defied logical military doctrine. He watched a human soldier named Tommy crawl through barbed wire to reach a wounded friend, knowing full well that enemy snipers had the area covered. The soldier took 3 bullets, but managed to drag his companion to safety before collapsing. Both died within minutes, but Tommy's face showed satisfaction, not regret. Zektar paused his recording. In all his observations of galactic warfare, he had never seen a being choose certain death for such a small tactical gain. Most species would have calculated the odds and retreated. The Valkyrie certainly would have. Even their greatest warriors understood that living to fight another day was more valuable than meaningless sacrifice. He fast-forwarded through the decades, observing the humans' technological progress. Their second global war presented new data points. The weapons had improved dramatically, but their behavior had become even more puzzling. A human pilot named Sarah Chun caught his attention. Her fighter was damaged, fuel leaking, engine sputtering. She could have ejected safely over friendly territory. Instead, she turned her dying aircraft toward an enemy bomber formation headed for a civilian population center. Zektar watched in fascination as she rammed her plane into the lead bomber, destroying herself and preventing the attack. Illogical, he muttered into his recording device. Subject sacrificed guaranteed survival for minimal tactical advantage. Emotional decision-making overrides basic survival instincts. But even as he spoke the words, something in Zektar's mind rebelled against the clinical assessment. He had seen the human's face in her final moments. There was no fear, no regret, only grim determination and something that looked like peace. The Cold War provided different insights. Humans had developed weapons capable of destroying their entire planet, yet they held back from using them. Other species typically used their most powerful weapons immediately upon creation. The Zephyrians had glassed their own homeworld within days of splitting the atom. The Corvani Empire had collapsed after using biological weapons that got out of control. Humans seemed to understand restraint in a way that most galactic civilizations did not. They fought proxy wars, engaged in espionage, built massive arsenals, but never crossed the ultimate line. Zektar noted this with growing confusion. Their individual soldiers showed reckless bravery, but their leaders displayed almost unprecedented caution with weapons of mass destruction. A particular incident during the Cuban Missile Crisis made Zektar stop his observations entirely for 3 days. A single Soviet naval officer named Vasily Arkhipov refused to authorize the launch of a nuclear torpedo, even when his submarine was under attack, and his fellow officers demanded retaliation. One human's decision had potentially saved millions of lives. Subject demonstrated individual initiative contradicting military hierarchy to prevent escalation, Zektar recorded. This level of independent moral reasoning is. He paused, searching for words in his own language. There was no equivalent concept among the Valkyrie. As the decades passed, human conflicts became more complex. Zektar observed their interventions in regional conflicts, their peacekeeping missions, their humanitarian operations. They fought not just for territory or resources, but for abstract concepts like freedom, justice, and human rights. In Somalia, he watched a squad of American soldiers fight through hostile streets to reach trapped comrades. The tactical situation was hopeless, the political ramifications severe, but they went anyway. When asked later why they risked everything for a mission that had already failed, one soldier simply said, "We don't leave our people behind." Zektar found himself replaying that footage repeatedly. No Valkyrie commander would have authorized such a mission. The cost-benefit analysis was obviously negative. Yet the humans acted without hesitation, driven by principles that made no logical sense. The emergence of asymmetric warfare provided new challenges for his analysis. Human opponents with vastly different technological capabilities found ways to level the playing field through pure determination. In Afghanistan, he observed fighters living in caves who held off the most advanced military force in human history for 20 years. But it was not just the insurgents who confounded him. The soldiers of that advanced military showed the same inexplicable behavior he had noted in earlier conflicts. They risked their lives for Afghan civilians who were strangers to them. They shared their rations with enemy children. They built schools and hospitals while under fire. Specialist Maria Rodriguez became another puzzle for Zektar to unravel. During a firefight in a small Afghan village, she left cover to shield a local child from crossfire. The tactical manual clearly stated that civilian casualties were acceptable to maintain mission security, yet she chose to expose herself to enemy fire for a being who was not even her own species. The child survived. Rodriguez did not. As medics worked frantically to save her, her final words were, "Is the kid okay?" Zektar stared at his monitoring screens for hours after recording that incident. He had observed thousands of species across the galaxy, but none exhibited such consistent disregard for self-preservation when protecting others. The Valkyrie had strong family bonds and would die for their offspring, but their care did not extend to strangers, especially not to alien species. Modern human conflicts presented even greater mysteries. Their soldiers deployed to distant countries for abstract goals like democracy and human rights. They fought not for conquest or resources, but to protect people they would never meet from governments they would never interact with. In Syria, Zektar observed human medical personnel treating wounded combatants from all sides of the conflict. Dr. Hassan al-Rashid worked 18-hour days in a bombed-out hospital, saving lives without regard for nationality, religion, or political affiliation. When asked why he stayed in such danger, he simply said, "These are human beings who need help." The concept was foreign to Zektar. Valkyrie physicians would treat their own people, perhaps allies under specific treaty obligations, but never enemies. The idea of providing aid without expectation of return, especially to hostiles, was literally inconceivable in his culture. Urban warfare in places like Mosul and Aleppo revealed new aspects of human nature. Soldiers cleared buildings room by room, accepting massive casualties to minimize civilian harm, when orbital bombardment would have been far more efficient. They fought with restraints that made no tactical sense, following rules of engagement that favored their enemies. Captain James Morrison and his unit spent 6 days fighting through a single apartment building, taking heavy casualties, because intelligence suggested civilians might be trapped in the basement. A single missile could have eliminated the building and the enemy fighters inside, but the possibility of innocent casualties made that option unacceptable. Zektar ran probability calculations on the tactical decision. The mathematical certainty of military casualties against the mere possibility of civilian casualties made Morrison's choice statistically insane. Yet when the basement was finally cleared, 3 families were found hiding there. Morrison died from his wounds 2 days later, but the expression on his face when the civilians were brought out safely was one of profound satisfaction. Sleep had become difficult for Zektar. The Valkyrie normally required only 3 hours of rest per day cycle. but he found himself lying awake for additional hours, thinking about what he had observed. His species valued efficiency, logic, and survival above all else. These humans seemed to value things that could not be quantified or measured. The emergence of global terrorism created new paradigms for Zektar to analyze. Human responses to attacks on civilians showed patterns he had not encountered in any other species' behavior. Instead of massive retaliation that would eliminate threats through overwhelming force, they often chose surgical strikes that minimized casualties even among their enemies. After attacks that killed thousands of innocent humans, their military responses were measured, careful, and focused on specific targets. Other galactic species would have turned entire planets to glass in response to such provocations. Humans seemed more concerned with avoiding innocent deaths among their enemies than with exacting proportional revenge. First Lieutenant Sarah Kim exemplified this restraint. During a raid on a terrorist compound, her unit discovered that enemies were using children as human shields. Standard galactic military doctrine would have proceeded with the mission regardless of civilian casualties. Kim ordered her unit to withdraw and called for specialized extraction teams, accepting the risk that targets might escape rather than harm innocents. The mission took 3 additional weeks to complete, cost significantly more resources, and resulted in several terrorists escaping to plan future attacks. Yet Kim showed no regret about her decision, even when questioned by superiors about the tactical implications. Zektar found himself studying human facial expressions during these moral decision points. Their features showed stress, uncertainty, sometimes anguish, but also something else. A quality his translation matrix could not properly interpret. The closest Valkyrie concept was rightness, but that did not capture the full meaning. Modern peacekeeping operations provided the most confusing data yet. Humans volunteered to deploy to regions where they had no strategic interests, to protect populations that were not their own, often at significant personal risk. They built infrastructure, provided medical care, and established security for people who could offer nothing in return. In South Sudan, Zektar observed Captain Jennifer Walsh working with local leaders to establish water purification systems while under constant threat from various armed factions. Her unit could have remained in their fortified base and fulfilled their mandate through minimal engagement, but instead they actively sought out opportunities to help local populations. When a cholera outbreak threatened a refugee camp, Walsh personally led medical teams into the infected area despite knowing that her own species could contract the disease. She worked alongside local doctors for 72 hours straight, helping treat patients and organize supply distributions. Risk assessment shows unacceptable probability of infection for minimal strategic gain, Zektar recorded. Subject continues mission despite clear personal danger. Motivation remains unclear. Yet as he watched Walsh collapse from exhaustion after the outbreak was contained, seeing her smile as she observed healthy children playing in the camp, Zektar felt something shift in his own thought patterns. The strategic gain might have been minimal, but there was clearly something else these humans valued more than tactical advantage. Space-based conflicts presented new challenges for analysis. As humans began establishing permanent settlements on Mars and the Moon, conflicts arose over resources and territorial claims. Zektar expected their behavior patterns to change in the vacuum of space, where survival margins were razor-thin and mistakes meant death. Instead, human space warfare showed the same inexplicable patterns he had observed on Earth. During the Mars mining station conflict, Commander Alex Chun could have disabled enemy life support systems with a simple sabotage operation. Instead, he chose to engage in prolonged conventional combat that cost his side significant casualties. When questioned about his tactical choices, Chun stated, "We're all human beings up here. Whatever our political differences, nobody deserves to die from vacuum exposure." Zektar paused his recording system and stared out at the stars surrounding his observation ship. In 4 centuries of monitoring galactic conflicts, he had never encountered a species that consistently chose the difficult path when easier options would have achieved the same strategic objectives. The more he observed, the more questions arose. These humans seemed to operate according to principles that superseded logical military doctrine. They accepted casualties to protect civilians. They showed mercy to enemies. They valued abstract concepts like honor and justice more than tactical advantage. His reports to the Galactic Council grew more complex and uncertain with each submission. How could he classify a species that defied every standard model of military behavior? Their individual fighters showed unprecedented bravery, but their strategic decisions demonstrated restraint unknown among other civilizations. They were simultaneously the most aggressive and most merciful warriors he had ever observed. As Zektar prepared his preliminary assessment, he realized that his observations had changed him in ways he did not fully understand. Sleep came harder now, filled with images of human soldiers making choices that seemed impossible. His own certainties about logic and efficiency had been shaken by watching beings who consistently chose principle over pragmatism. The humans were approaching faster-than-light capability. Soon they would join the galactic community, and the Council would need his assessment to determine how to integrate them. But how could he explain a species whose behavior patterns defied every established model of intelligent life? Zektar looked down at his preliminary report, then deleted it entirely. He would need more time, more observations, more understanding before he could even begin to classify these impossible beings who called themselves human. The nightmares began after Zektar observed the liberation of Buchenwald. For 3 centuries, he had watched civilizations rise and fall with clinical detachment. The Valkyrie mind was designed for objective analysis, capable of processing horror without emotional contamination. But something about the human soldiers walking through those camps broke through his mental barriers. He had seen genocide before. The Thrakkery had eliminated 17 species during their expansion phase. The Silicon Collective had processed entire populations for raw materials. But those were efficient, calculated extinctions driven by resource needs or territorial expansion. This was something else entirely. Staff Sergeant Robert King was among the first Allied soldiers to enter the camp. Zektar monitored his biometric readings as King surveyed the skeletal prisoners, the mass graves, the industrial machinery of death. The human's heart rate spiked, stress hormones flooded his system, but his actions remained controlled and purposeful. King removed his own rations and began distributing them to prisoners, even though military doctrine required maintaining personal supply reserves. When a dying prisoner grabbed his hand and whispered something in a language King did not understand, the soldier knelt beside the man until he passed away. A logical resource allocation, Zektar recorded automatically. Subject compromises personal survival margins for beings who cannot contribute to tactical objectives. But even as he spoke the words, Zektar found himself studying King's facial expressions. There was anguish there, rage, but also something harder to define. A kind of recognition, as if the soldier was seeing something that affirmed his deepest beliefs about right and wrong. Other soldiers showed similar patterns. They gave away food, medical supplies, even clothing to prisoners who were effectively strangers. They wept openly at what they witnessed, then worked tirelessly to help survivors despite having no orders to do so. Their commanding officers not only allowed this behavior, but actively encouraged it. Major Patricia Cole organized medical teams to treat former prisoners, requisitioned supplies for refugee camps, and established temporary housing facilities. When asked by war correspondents about these humanitarian efforts, she simply said, "This is why we fight." Zektar replayed that statement dozens of times. Most galactic species fought for territory, resources, or survival. These humans seemed to fight for abstract principles that they could not even clearly articulate. The concept of fighting to prevent suffering among strangers was unprecedented in his observations. The aftermath of the European conflict revealed more puzzling behavior. Instead of exploiting their defeated enemies, humans implemented massive reconstruction programs. The Marshall Plan involved transferring enormous resources to former opponents, helping rebuild the same industrial capacity that had recently been used against them. General George Marshall himself supervised much of the effort. Zektar monitored planning sessions where Marshall argued for generous aid packages despite strong opposition from those who wanted Germany left economically crippled. The general's reasoning was purely strategic. A stable Europe would be more peaceful, but the scale of assistance defied normal post-conflict behavior. Subject species demonstrates unprecedented post-victory restraint, Zektar noted. Standard galactic protocol involves resource extraction from defeated populations. Humans instead invest in enemy recovery. Motivation appears to be long-term stability rather than immediate gain. But there was something else in the human approach that Zektar struggled to quantify. They seemed genuinely concerned about the welfare of people who had recently been trying to kill them. Former German soldiers were fed, housed, and given opportunities for peaceful reintegration. Children who had been indoctrinated with enemy ideology were educated rather than eliminated. Captain William Hayes supervised a displaced persons camp outside Munich. His job was maintaining order and basic security, but Zektar observed him spending hours each day talking with former Wehrmacht soldiers, helping them write letters to locate missing family members, even sharing personal photographs of his own children back in Iowa. When asked why he fraternized with former enemies, Hayes said, "They're just people who got caught up in something bigger than they understood. Most of them want the same things I do. To go home, see their families, live in peace." The concept of seeing enemies as fundamentally similar to oneself was foreign to Zektar's understanding. Valkyrie military doctrine emphasized dehumanization of opponents as a psychological necessity for effective combat. These humans seemed capable of fighting fiercely while still recognizing their enemies' basic humanity. The Korean conflict provided new data points that further confused Zektar's analysis. Human soldiers fought in brutal conditions against an enemy that showed no mercy, yet maintained strict rules of engagement regarding civilian populations and prisoner treatment. They accepted significant tactical disadvantages to avoid unnecessary casualties among non-combatants. Lieutenant Colonel Marcus Thompson led a unit that held a strategic hill against overwhelming odds for 6 days. Chinese forces offered to spare his men if they abandoned Korean civilians sheltering in nearby caves. Thompson refused, knowing that his position would eventually be overrun and his men would likely be killed. The tactical mathematics were simple: sacrifice a few dozen civilians to save several hundred soldiers. Any rational commander would have made that calculation. Thompson instead ordered his unit to hold position until evacuation helicopters could remove the civilians, even though this meant fighting against impossible odds. 43 of Thompson's men died in the final assault, but all the civilians were evacuated safely. His final radio transmission was, "Mission accomplished. Civilians secure." Zektar found himself analyzing that transmission for hours. In what sense had Thompson accomplished his mission? His unit was destroyed, the strategic position was lost, and the tactical situation deteriorated significantly. Yet the human officer considered the operation successful based solely on civilian casualties avoided. The pattern repeated in Vietnam, with even more confusing variations. American soldiers fought in an environment where distinguishing combatants from non-combatants was nearly impossible, yet they continued to operate under rules of engagement that prioritized civilian protection over military efficiency. Corporal Daniel Martinez embodied these contradictions. During the Tet Offensive, his squad was ordered to clear a building believed to contain enemy fighters. Upon entry, they discovered it was actually a medical clinic treating wounded civilians from all sides of the conflict. Standard military doctrine would have been to secure the building and interrogate personnel for intelligence purposes. Instead, Martinez and his men helped defend the clinic against subsequent attacks, using their ammunition and medical supplies to protect patients who included wounded enemy soldiers. Subject prioritizes humanitarian concerns over tactical advantage, Zektar recorded. Unit sacrifices strategic position to defend enemy combatants. Behavior pattern inconsistent with survival instincts or logical military doctrine. Yet as he watched Martinez work alongside Vietnamese doctors to treat a wounded child, Zektar noticed something in the soldier's expression that he had seen before. The same quality he had observed in King at Buchenwald, in Thompson on the Korean Hill, in countless other humans making impossible choices. It was not pride or satisfaction, exactly. It was something deeper, more fundamental. As if these actions aligned with some core aspect of human nature that superseded military training or national loyalty. The end of the Cold War provided new revelations about human restraint. For decades, Both superpowers had possessed weapons capable of ending human civilization, yet they had never used them. Other galactic species had typically destroyed themselves within years of developing such capability. Zektar studied recordings of tense moments when nuclear war seemed inevitable. The Cuban Missile Crisis, Able Archer 83, the Norwegian rocket incident. In each case, individual humans had made decisions that pulled their species back from the brink of self-annihilation. During the 1995 incident, a single submarine commander named Boris Kuznetsov received what appeared to be launch authorization from Moscow. His standing orders were to fire immediately upon confirmation of attack. Instead, he demanded additional verification, delaying launch while confirming that the radar signature was actually a scientific rocket, not an incoming missile. Individual initiative contradicts military hierarchy to prevent species extinction, Zektar noted. Subject risks personal consequences to verify targeting data. Decision demonstrates prioritization of species survival over following orders. But it was more than just species survival. Kuznetsov could have targeted military installations while avoiding population centers. He could have launched a limited strike to demonstrate resolve without triggering full retaliation. Instead, he chose to risk court-martial rather than take any action that might harm innocent people. Modern human conflicts presented new puzzles. Peacekeeping operations in Bosnia, Somalia, Rwanda, and dozens of other locations showed humans deploying military force not for conquest, but to prevent suffering among populations they had no connection to. In Rwanda, General Romeo Dallaire commanded a small UN peacekeeping force during the genocide. His mandate was limited to observing and reporting, but Dallaire repeatedly exceeded his authority to protect civilians. With only 270 soldiers, he could not stop the slaughter, but he saved over 32,000 lives by housing refugees at UN facilities and negotiating temporary ceasefires. Zektar analyzed the strategic mathematics of Dallaire's actions. The general gained nothing for his home country, received no recognition for his efforts, and suffered severe psychological trauma from witnessing events he could not prevent. Yet he continued working beyond his orders, his resources, and his mental limits to save as many lives as possible. Subject operates beyond mandate parameters to assist non-allied populations, Zektar recorded. No strategic benefit identified. Personal cost severe. Motivation appears to be prevention of suffering rather than tactical gain. The more Zektar observed, the more he realized that human military behavior could not be understood through traditional strategic analysis. Their soldiers consistently chose difficult paths when easier alternatives existed. They accepted casualties to protect civilians. They showed mercy to enemies. They fought for abstract principles rather than concrete benefits. But it was not just individual soldiers. Their entire military structure seemed designed to emphasize restraint and protection of non-combatants. Rules of engagement, prisoner treatment protocols, humanitarian law compliance. These were not afterthoughts, but central elements of human military doctrine. During the Gulf War, Zektar observed pilots who aborted bombing runs because of possible civilian presence, even when targets were strategically vital. Tank crews who stopped advances to provide medical aid to wounded enemy soldiers. Infantry units that risked ambush to evacuate non-combatants from combat zones. Colonel Sarah Mitchell commanded an armored unit tasked with capturing a strategic bridge. Intelligence indicated that Iraqi forces were using a nearby hospital as a command center. Instead of destroying the building, Mitchell ordered a complex ground assault that took 18 hours and cost her unit significant casualties, but left the hospital functional. When questioned about the tactical decision, Mitchell said, "There were patients in that hospital who had nothing to do with this war. Our job is to defeat enemy forces, not harm innocent people." Zektar replayed that statement repeatedly, trying to understand the distinction Mitchell was making. The hospital was being used for military purposes, making it a legitimate target under any rational interpretation of warfare. Yet she treated it as inviolate because of the civilian presence. The concept seemed to be that humans distinguished between justified and unjustified violence even during combat operations. They could kill enemy soldiers while simultaneously protecting enemy civilians, not because of tactical considerations, but because of moral principles that Zektar could not fully comprehend. Sleep had become increasingly elusive. Zektar found himself lying awake during his rest periods, replaying scenes of human soldiers making impossible choices. His own species valued efficiency and survival above all else, but these humans seemed driven by something beyond rational calculation. The pattern extended to modern asymmetric conflicts. In Iraq and Afghanistan, human soldiers fought enemies who used civilians as shields, operated from schools and mosques, and deliberately targeted non-combatants. Yet the humans maintained strict rules of engagement that often prevented them from using their technological advantages. Sergeant First Class Maria Santos led a patrol that came under fire from insurgents positioned in a crowded marketplace. Her unit could have called in artillery support that would have eliminated the threat within minutes. Instead, they fought a running battle through narrow streets, taking casualties to minimize civilian harm. Santos herself was wounded while evacuating a local shopkeeper who had been caught in crossfire. As medics treated her injuries, she insisted on knowing whether the civilian had reached safety. Her final words before losing consciousness were, "Did we get him out?" The tactical situation was clearly negative. Santos had risked her unit for a single non-combatant who was not even from her own species. Yet her primary concern was not the strategic implications of her wound, but the welfare of a stranger who happened to be in danger. Zektar found himself analyzing Santos's facial expressions in the moments before she lost consciousness. Despite her injuries, despite the tactical failure, despite the strategic complications, she showed the same quality he had observed in countless other humans making similar choices. It was not pride or satisfaction. It was something more fundamental, as if these actions were expressions of core human identity rather than tactical decisions. These soldiers seemed to be fighting not just for victory, but for the right to consider themselves human. The realization that human military behavior might be driven by identity rather than strategy changed everything about Zektar's analysis. If these beings fought to maintain their concept of moral selfhood, then their tactical choices made a different kind of sense. They did not choose difficult paths because they were inefficient. They chose difficult paths because easy paths would have required them to compromise principles that defined their species' identity. The cost in casualties was acceptable because the cost in self-definition would have been unbearable. As Zektar prepared his second interim report, he realized that his observations had fundamentally altered his understanding of warfare itself. For centuries, he had viewed combat as resource competition between competing survival systems. But humans seemed to view warfare as a test of moral character, where victory achieved through unworthy means was actually defeat. His sleep cycles had become completely disrupted. Dreams filled with images of human soldiers making choices that defied every model of rational behavior. But more disturbing than the dreams was the growing recognition that these impossible choices somehow made perfect sense from a perspective he was only beginning to understand. Zektar had not slept properly in 47 days. His final observation period was supposed to last only 3 months, enough time to complete humanity's combat assessment before they achieved faster-than-light capability. But 12 months had passed, and he was no closer to understanding these impossible beings than when he had started. The dreams were constant now. Fragments of human conflicts played endlessly through his mind during rest periods. Faces of soldiers making choices that violated every principle of tactical rationality. Children being protected by strangers. Enemies being shown mercy. Civilians being valued above strategic objectives. His ship's medical system had begun issuing alerts about his deteriorating condition. Valkyrie physiology required precise sleep cycles to maintain cognitive function, but Zektar could not silence the questions that kept him awake. How could he classify beings whose behavior defied every established model of intelligent life? The Galactic Council had sent increasingly urgent requests for his preliminary assessment. Humanity was only weeks away from achieving interstellar flight, and integration protocols required advanced classification of military capabilities and threat levels. But Zektar's reports had grown more confused and contradictory with each submission. Recommend immediate council consultation. His latest message had read, Subject species exhibits behavioral patterns inconsistent with existing classification models. Further observation required before assessment completion. The Council's response had been swift and clear. Complete assessment immediately. Human first contact imminent. Classification cannot be delayed. Zektar stared at his monitoring systems, watching real-time feeds from the International Space Station, where human engineers were making final preparations for their first faster-than-light test flight. In 72 hours, humanity would join the galactic community, and his assessment would determine how other species would interact with them. A priority alert drew his attention to surface conflicts. He had been monitoring human military operations in 6 different theaters, trying to understand their modern combat doctrine. What he saw defied every prediction model his computers could generate. In Eastern Europe, Captain James Harrison commanded a peacekeeping unit tasked with protecting a refugee convoy. Intelligence indicated that hostile forces were planning an ambush along the only viable route. Standard military doctrine would have been to abandon the convoy or wait for heavy reinforcements. Instead, Harrison deployed his unit of 23 soldiers to hold a defensive position against an estimated 200 attackers. The tactical mathematics were simple. His unit would be destroyed, but the convoy might escape during the fighting. Unacceptable casualty ratios for minimal strategic gain. Zektar recorded automatically. Commanding officer prioritizes non-allied civilian protection over unit preservation. But, as he watched Harrison's pre-battle briefing, Zektar noticed something that had become familiar in his observations. The human soldiers showed fear, uncertainty, knowledge that they faced overwhelming odds, yet none suggested abandoning the mission. Their questions focused on maximizing civilian survival rather than their own tactical situation. Sergeant Lisa Chun asked about evacuation routes for wounded refugees. Corporal David Kim wanted to know which vehicles carried children so they could be prioritized for protection. Private Maria Gonzalez requested permission to distribute her personal medical supplies to convoy medics. These soldiers knew they were likely to die, yet their concerns centered on people they had never met, refugees from a country most of them could not locate on a map. The convoy included over 4,000 civilians fleeing ethnic violence, but Harrison's unit had no national interest in their survival, no strategic reason to protect them. When the battle began, Zektar watched in fascination as human tactical doctrine adapted to impossible circumstances. Instead of conventional defensive positions, Harrison's unit used hit-and-run tactics designed to draw attacks away from the convoy. They accepted engagement on unfavorable terms to keep enemy forces focused on military rather than civilian targets. Private Michael Torres held a bridge approach for 47 minutes against constant assault, knowing that falling back would expose refugee families to direct fire. His position was overrun, but the delay allowed most civilians to reach safety. His final radio transmission was, "Convoys through. Mission accomplished." 17 of Harrison's 23 soldiers died in the action, but over 3,800 refugees reached the safety zone. By any rational military assessment, the operation was a catastrophic failure. Yet Harrison's after-action report classified it as successful based solely on civilian casualties avoided. Zektar paused his recording and reviewed the tactical data. In 4 centuries of observing galactic warfare, he had never seen a military unit deliberately accept destruction to protect non-allied civilians. The concept violated basic survival instincts and strategic logic. Yet this was not an isolated incident. Similar patterns appeared in every human conflict he monitored. In the Middle East, UN peacekeepers used their own bodies to shield civilian populations from crossfire. In Africa, humanitarian workers remained in active war zones to continue providing medical care. In Asia, disaster relief teams deployed to dangerous areas despite minimal chances of successful rescue operations. Sergeant First Class Amanda Rodriguez exemplified this pattern during earthquake relief operations in a politically unstable region. Her medical team was supposed to withdraw when fighting broke out between local factions, but Rodriguez discovered a collapsed school with children trapped inside. Standard protocol required immediate evacuation of relief personnel when security situations deteriorated. The trapped children were not American citizens. Their rescue would provide no strategic benefit, and Rodriguez's team risked capture or death by remaining in the area. Instead, She radioed for permission to stay and coordinate rescue efforts. When permission was denied, she formally requested to volunteer for the mission as an individual rather than as a military representative. Her superiors approved the request, knowing they would lose a valuable medic for no tactical gain. Rodriguez spent 18 hours directing local rescue workers, using her medical training to keep injured children alive while heavy machinery cleared debris. When local fighters demanded that relief operations cease, she negotiated with them personally, explaining that they were trying to save children who belonged to their own community. The fighters not only allowed the rescue to continue but provided security and additional manpower. Rodriguez later said, "It's amazing what people will do when they realize you're not trying to hurt anyone. We were all just trying to save kids." Zektar replayed that statement dozens of times. Rodriguez had transformed a hostile military situation into a humanitarian cooperation by appealing to shared values regarding child protection. She had converted enemies into allies not through force or deception, but by demonstrating that human soldiers could prioritize civilian welfare over tactical advantage. The incident revealed something that Zektar's analysis models had consistently failed to capture. Human military effectiveness was not just based on weapons, training, or tactical doctrine. They possessed an unusual ability to recognize shared humanity even in enemies, and to convert conflict situations into cooperative efforts when common ground could be established. Modern counterterrorism operations provided additional examples of this phenomenon. Instead of treating captured fighters as sources of intelligence to be exploited, humans often tried to understand the motivations and grievances that had led to extremism. Captain Robert Mitchell commanded a unit that captured a bomb maker responsible for attacks that had killed dozens of civilians. Standard interrogation protocols would have focused on extracting tactical intelligence about future attacks and identifying other cell members. Instead, Mitchell spent hours talking with the prisoner about his family, his background, his beliefs about justice, and religion. The conversations revealed that the bomber had joined extremist groups after coalition forces accidentally killed his children during a poorly planned operation. Understanding enemy motivation provides strategic intelligence, Zektar noted. However, subject appears to be seeking personal comprehension rather than tactical advantage. Mitchell's discussions with the prisoner led to detailed knowledge about recruitment methods, cell structure, and planned operations. But, more significantly, they resulted in the prisoner voluntarily providing information about civilian hostages and helping to negotiate the surrender of other cell members. Subject converted hostile prisoner into willing intelligence asset through recognition of shared loss, Zektar recorded. Emotional connection proved more effective than coercive interrogation. The pattern repeated in dozens of similar situations. Human soldiers seemed uniquely capable of finding common ground with enemies, transforming military situations through appeals to universal human experiences like family, loss, hope, and fear. Space-based conflicts provided the final pieces of Zektar's puzzle. As humanity expanded beyond Earth, their conflicts took on new dimensions but maintained the same impossible behavioral patterns. During the Mars colony crisis, separatist groups had declared independence and threatened to destroy atmospheric processors that supplied oxygen to dependent settlements. Earth forces could have simply destroyed the separatist installations and restored control, but this would have resulted in thousands of civilian casualties. Instead, Commander Sarah Kim spent 6 months negotiating with separatist leaders while maintaining a blockade that prevented violence, but allowed humanitarian supplies to reach civilian populations. The siege cost significantly more than military action would have, but Kim refused to authorize attacks that might harm non-combatants. Extended siege operations provide no strategic benefit compared to direct assault, Zektar noted. Commander prioritizes enemy civilian welfare over operational efficiency. Kim's patience eventually paid off when moderate separatist leaders agreed to negotiations that led to autonomous governance rather than complete independence. The solution satisfied most political demands while maintaining essential infrastructure cooperation. No lives were lost, and both sides achieved acceptable outcomes. The diplomatic resolution contradicted every model of human behavior that Zektar's observations should have supported. These were beings who fought with unprecedented aggression when necessary, yet showed remarkable restraint when alternatives existed. They could be warriors and peacekeepers simultaneously, depending on what the situation required. As his assessment deadline approached, Zektar realized that his insomnia was not just about completing the report. The humans had changed something fundamental about his understanding of existence itself. For 4 centuries, he had believed that intelligence inevitably led to ruthless efficiency and survival optimization. But these beings had achieved galactic-level technology while maintaining compassion for strangers, mercy for enemies, and sacrifice for abstract principles. They had developed weapons capable of destroying worlds while choosing not to use them. They had reached space while still caring about individuals who could provide no benefit to their species' advancement. The concept was transforming Zektar's own thought patterns in ways he could not control. During rest periods, he found himself thinking about Velkari military doctrine and questioning assumptions he had never examined. His own species valued efficiency and survival, but what did they value beyond mere continuation? Humans seemed to believe that how they survived was more important than whether they survived. They would rather die with honor than live with shame. They would rather lose with integrity than win through cruelty. These were not survival adaptations, but something entirely different. Zektar's final report would determine how the galactic community interacted with humanity. If he classified them as highly aggressive, other species would approach them with military caution. If he labeled them as dangerously unpredictable, they might be quarantined or eliminated before they could spread beyond their home system. But neither classification captured the truth about what he had observed. These beings were simultaneously the most dangerous and most benevolent species he had encountered. They could wage war with devastating efficiency while maintaining strict moral boundaries. They could show mercy to enemies while fighting fiercely for principles. The night before his final report was due, Zektar made a decision that would have been impossible for him 12 months earlier. Instead of trying to fit humans into existing classification systems, he would recommend creating an entirely new category based on what he had learned. He began writing, "Subject species exhibits unprecedented combination of military capability and moral restraint. Recommend classification as protected guardians, beings capable of extreme violence, but constrained by internal ethical systems that prioritize civilian welfare and enemy rights. Threat assessment: minimal to allied populations, potentially extreme to hostile forces that threaten civilians or violate humanitarian principles. Humans appear incapable of conquest for material gain, but may use overwhelming force to prevent suffering or protect the innocent. Integration recommendation: full alliance status with understanding that human military cooperation will be conditioned on adherence to their moral standards regarding civilian protection and prisoner treatment. Warning: do not mistake human restraint for weakness. Their willingness to accept casualties to avoid civilian harm should not be interpreted as tactical limitation. Observed evidence suggests that humans become exponentially more dangerous when moral boundaries are violated by opposing forces. Personal note: extended observation of human combat behavior has revealed that intelligence and morality are not mutually exclusive evolutionary adaptations. This species demonstrates that technological advancement can coexist with ethical behavior, challenging fundamental assumptions about the nature of galactic civilization. Zektar submitted his report and immediately requested reassignment to long-term human observation duties. He knew that sleep would return eventually, but the dreams would never fully fade. He had been assigned to watch humans fight, and in the process, they had taught him something about what it meant to be truly alive. The humans achieved faster-than-light capability 3 days later. When their first exploration ships encountered other galactic species, they carried medical supplies, cultural gifts, and formal diplomatic protocols emphasizing peaceful contact. They also carried weapons capable of destroying planets, but those remained powered down and secured unless threatened. The message was clear: we come in peace, but we are not defenseless, and we will not allow harm to innocents. Zektar watched from his observation post as humanity took its first steps into the wider galaxy, knowing that the universe would never be the same. They had shown him that strength and compassion could coexist, that wisdom included knowing when not to use power, and that some things were worth fighting for even when victory seemed impossible. His insomnia had become a permanent condition, but Zektar no longer minded. Sleep was a small price to pay for understanding what he had witnessed. The humans had taught him that some knowledge changed you forever, and that change was worth any cost. The dreams would continue, but now they were filled with hope rather than confusion. Somewhere in the galaxy, beings existed who fought not just to survive, but to ensure that survival meant something worth preserving.